Okay, so Mark is a seasoned marketing executive with over 25 years of experience in the industry. He drives profits and increases sales through data analytics along with improving client relationships and processes. He's got deep experience in project management and operational support, and he's really done a great job both on the practitioner side and on the consulting side of achieving performance results. He's included his work with where he is now at Confirmit, Walker CX, and InfoDynamics. He's helped them grow double-digit growth, and he is one of the only people who actually, when we went through and did that survey to see who had what experience, he actually was a subject matter expert in virtually all of the different categories. So he made it really easy for me to plug him in on the one that everybody else said, well, we don't have much on this. So that's really fabulous. I really appreciated his desire and his passion to help. So he loves to keep up to date, and it really shows in this particular session. So I'm going to turn it over to you now and go.
Thank you so much, Valerie. There is absolutely no way I'll live up to that nice introduction. So other than the 25 years, which is really Valerie's way of saying I'm a really old guy, and all that would be true.
Yeah, along with me, old age and treachery always win out of youth and beauty.
That's right. That's right. So there are really three things that we'll cover today. First of all, I'm very happy to be with you. And Valerie was very generous in saying, you know, I've got subject matter expertise in all the areas. That's, you know, that is overly generous. I've worked for a long time in the space. So I'm happy to be here, happy to share any perspectives. We'll talk about corporate culture and CX. We'll talk about that in a broad context. We'll drill down into a couple of areas in particular that I think will have particular relevance from the exam perspective. We'll go through, I've got 12 questions that we can go through. I sent the, I had set up a Kahoot session. I think a couple of people were able to go through it, but I should have gotten that out earlier so that folks would have had an opportunity. But we'll go through those questions, and then we'll conclude with just some observations and some unsolicited advice on the exam itself. So Valerie's covered all of this. The one thing I'd point out is I've worked with a lot of companies like Cisco Systems, Lenovo, Dun & Bradstreet, across a variety of verticals. And the common theme has been, how do we help them to advance CX in their organizations? And so with that, let's talk a little bit about the exam itself, because this is really how I framed some of the points that I'll discuss here today. It's about 14% of the exam, and this is directly from the CXPA, creating and nurturing a culture through behaviors, practices, and standards that encourages all employees to focus on delivering outstanding customer experiences. Then you see the various job tasks that come down. And the interesting thing about this, in a lot of the other sessions, it was really more about how we interact with either data or customers or processes. This is really where we start to get into pulling all of that together. And that's kind of the essence of culture. So let's just start out with a working definition of corporate culture. I'm not going to read this to you, but I will point out a couple of the things that jump out at me. It's the beliefs and behaviors of an organization, often implied, not expressly defined, develops organically over time. It's the kind of thing that you would say, I know it when I see it, but I don't necessarily know how I would describe it. It manifests itself in things like dress code, business hours, office setup, client satisfaction, every other aspect of operation. So the logical question then is, well, if that's corporate culture, what does that mean relative to CX? And as I was putting this together, I was kind of struggling a bit, because I would think about a certain topic that we might want to discuss, and I think, oh, well, that was covered in week 2, or that was covered in week 3 or week 5. The reality of this is culture is about bringing all of those elements together. The voice of customer, organizational adoption, CX strategy, experience design, metrics and ROI, and really bringing them to life and embedding them in the DNA of the organization. And that's what makes culture so compelling. It's really the execution of all of those elements in a way that weaves itself into the fiber of the organization. Now, why is that important? I firmly believe that at the end of the day, when you look at how companies compete, if you think about, what are some of the things that companies compete on? Well, there's products and services. Well, over time, competitors can either copy products or they'll innovate and move around existing products in the marketplace. You can seek to offer similar services. You can hire from the same schools. You can buy the same equipment. We probably, if we compared the laptops that we're all working from, there's probably a pretty good overlap in terms of the companies and the models of machines that we're working with. So there's so much that doesn't allow companies to be distinctive over time. Culture is the one thing that once you have it, it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, for a competitor to completely replicate. So consequently, I think it's the ultimate source of competitive advantage. At Confirm It, we have developed a CX maturity assessment, and there are lots of CX maturity assessments in the marketplace. We have developed one that has 5 dimensions of CX maturity, and I bring this up in the context of culture because I believe when we think about these elements, this is all consistent with how we would look at a CX culture. So it starts with a vision. What's our destination? How do we know what it is that we want to do? How do we know when we get there? How do we prioritize? Phase. So do we have the right equipment? That gets in. Can you hear me now?
Yep, well, I could.
We can hear you.
Okay, good. Good. So once we understand the vision, then we get into things like design. Do we have the right infrastructure in place? That gets into things like data capture. This is really where voice of customer tends to exist. It's how do we, and the metrics, how do we make certain that we're capturing the right information, conducting the right kind of analysis, and reporting that broadly. Well, why is that important? Because once we have that, it's all about engagement. So do we have the right team on board? And we talk about engagement, you often hear, well, is this a top-down initiative? Is this a grassroots initiative? The reality is that engagement needs to be both. You need to have leadership, sponsorship, but you also need to empower the front line. That's critically important when we think about a CX-oriented culture. When we think about why it's important to have engagement, it's because if you don't have engagement, you're not likely to have action. And if you're doing this all to get a score, whether that's a net promoter score, and I'm a very quantitatively oriented person. I love scores, I love numbers. But at the end of the day, it's less about that and the actions that we take because of what those numbers tell us. And so do we know what we need to do? Really on 2 dimensions, this kind of the idea of local action, what Bain calls the inner loop, or kind of case level management, or more strategic change. Bain calls that the outer loop, to make certain that we're looking more systemically. Ultimately, all 4 of these coalesce to create value, which is impact on the bottom line. And if we are not delivering on that, we are really missing a huge opportunity. In fact, end of last year, I think it was Harley Manning at Forrester wrote a blog series that started out with the, at least for me, alarming prediction that in 2020, up to I think 1 in 4 CX professionals will lose their jobs. I don't know how he's doing relative to that prediction, but paradoxically at the same time, he said there was immense growth in the customer experience space. So what explains the differential? It was all about how we are able to capture, articulate the ROI, and deliver value to the organization. So it starts, I believe, with culture. And so what do you need to have a CX culture? First of all, I firmly believe you have to lead by example, and that starts at the top. you simply cannot have a culture that says we are customer centric if your leadership is not customer centric, or if your leadership creates processes or rules that prevent you from being customer centric. You need to have a defined vision. Again, this vision element comes in, and it's building the vision of the brand around the customer. And as importantly, constantly communicating the vision both internally and externally. When I work with clients, I will often hear, oh my gosh, I have told this CX story so many times, and if I have to say it one more time, my head's going to explode. And I say, you know, if that's how you're feeling, you might be off to a decent start because you can't communicate enough. So just understand that just because you understand the vision and it's entrenched in you, part of our jobs as CX professionals is to help spread that and to embed it in the organization. So in order to do that effectively, we really need to know how know and engage both customers and employees. And this is interesting because where we've seen the state of CX evolve, you're seeing more and more. We've seen it for a long time, but you're seeing even more of late around the notion of the connection between customer experience and employee experience. It's the idea that you treat employees well, they will treat customers well, they'll treat employees well, and it creates this virtuous cycle that then leads to positive business outcomes. And you have to do that. That is actually a great outcome of a CX culture. So how do we do that? We have to understand what motivates them, and we have to understand their expectations and needs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. As in anything, I'm a big fan of the book Freakonomics. If you haven't read it, would certainly encourage you. It's an economist's view of social phenomenon through the eyes of an economist, which all talks about the incentive structures and how do the incentive structures generate behavior. And so we have to have the right kinds of incentives to make certain that we are earning loyalty from customers and engagement from our employees. I said earlier, as much as it is important to have top-down leadership and support, the next step of that is empowering employees across the entirety of the organization to take action. You want to empower them. You really want to spend time training them so that they will understand what is the right thing to do for a given customer in the context of what the company offers, so that they can become and can exhibit that customer orientation. And then finally, looking outside in, bringing the customer's perspectives to the table. This is all, this is kind of the essence of customer journey mapping and understanding the journey that the customer takes and the various interaction points and moments of truth and those sorts of things. So I would say these are the key elements that you would need from a culture perspective. I want to just talk a bit about the evolution of successful CX programs. And the reason I want to talk about this is because having a CX culture is critical. And in fact, we see three distinct phases of CX programs. There's the getting established phase. And usually what that is, it's focused on managers or frontline. It's about, if you're in the kind of space that I'm in, or the kind of work that Valerie does, you might hear somebody say, I want to do a customer satisfaction survey, or I want to learn more about what customers think. And so consequently, when you're getting established, it's a lot about getting the basics right and closing the loop. You do that through things like voice of customer, voice of partner supplier, if you're looking at the entirety of the supply chain, voice of business. And the outcomes from a business impact perspective, it's all about customer retention, and I would argue more importantly, understanding the customer reality. So that's, you're kind of starting to kind of put your toe in the water at this point and get established. Most organizations do the getting established, and do it, it's fairly pervasive. We start to see drop-offs when we think about things like wider perspective, which is really all about focusing on senior leadership and things like change management. Those concepts that were talked about a couple of weeks ago. And the objective here is to make customer-centric decisions and process improvement. And so the way we do that is we augment what we do in the getting established with things like voice of customer through the employee, voice of the market, more outside oriented perspectives. And so the outcome, what is the business impact of a wider perspective? Well, it starts to allow us to look at product and service improvement and team engagement. And again, we see fewer companies that get to this, but then there's the idea of embedded CX. And why is embedded CX important? Well, it's interesting because it reverts back to the focus on managers in the front line. And why is that? It's because you've been able to make pervasive the elements of the culture so that we can go back, we've got the top-down support. Now we can then focus again on the front line, because what we're looking for is behavior change and customer centricity. This is where we'll start to move beyond just surveys. We're looking at things like operational data, financial data, other employee engagement data that you might have to really bring that to bear. And the outcome is not only sustainable business growth, but it's a true customer-centric culture. And so the notion here is, as I think about this, what differentiates a company's ability to move from getting established to the wider perspective to embedded CX? It's all about the organization's proclivity to embrace a true customer-oriented culture. I will stop there. And Valerie, I don't know if there are any questions. I don't have the
chat on. Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions right now, but team, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. Yeah, I was really interested in what you said about the culture and how change management and culture are tied. But then if you look at things like the culture and the brand promise and all of that, it sits above everything we do as a company, don't you think?
Yeah, well, and I think so. It's all about the brand promise, but there's a bit of kind of the rubber meets the road, right? So there is no organization on the planet that won't say, we really care about our customers, right? Customers are, one of our key focal points, but yet we can all think about organizations where that doesn't really, the hype doesn't match the reality. And so that's the difference to me between brand promise and brand reality. And so that's why the difference between brand promise and brand reality, I think, is culture, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a little bit about the exam. So consequently, as we think about the notion of what role employees play in culture, these employee-related concepts tend to be pretty heavily prevalent for these types of questions. And so just a few concepts that I would throw out and share with you as you're thinking about and prepping. First of all, one of the questions that I think almost always comes up, or at least I see it a lot in a lot of the exam type questions and simulations that I've seen, is the idea of what is the easiest way to become a customer-focused organization. The easiest way to do that is to hire customer-oriented employees, which when we think about makes perfect sense. It's kind of the, do we hire for skills and then try to make the culture emerge, or do we hire for the person and train them on the specifics of the job? And so consequently, what this means is part of the CX culture is being able to embed CX concepts into things like how you recruit, how you interview, how you hire, and how you fire. Because the hardest employees to deal with are the ones who don't live out that CX orientation, and yet still make or exceed things like sales targets, or they're technically very good at their job. And true CX organizations deal with that because they understand that there's a long-term cost of not dealing with that. Talked a little bit about the linkage of employee experience and customer experience. Think about ideas about using feedback from employees about the customer experience. Again, this is where in journey mapping in particular, where you can pull in the perspectives of employees about, well, what is it that our customers actually experience at any given stage of the journey? The idea of voice of customer through employee, where you're using your employees as a proxy for what the customers see. It's a great way to help understand where service or process gaps might exist. And then this third line is the law of congruent experience. And this is the idea that the experience that employees provide to customers will be constrained by their own experience in the organization. So what does that mean? Well, we have to treat our customers well, or our employees well. We have to have fair processes. We have to have fair standards. We want to create the experience for them that they will then use to create the positive experience for customers. We talked about motivating employees, and a concept that comes up often is the idea of Herzberg's two-factor theory of motivation. And what this theory, which is about 50 years old, but it still seems to have quite, it's got legs in the literature. I think Harvard Business Review just reprinted it not too long ago. There are two factors. There are hygiene issues, and these are kind of extrinsic factors. Things like work conditions, salary, the relationship you have with your supervisor. And hygiene issues are things that when you do well, you are avoiding job dissatisfaction. You're not creating job satisfaction, you are avoiding job dissatisfaction. And then there are motivators. These are intrinsic factors. And when you're doing well on the motivators, you lead to job satisfaction. One of Herzberg's main tenets is that the opposite of satisfaction isn't dissatisfaction. It's the opposite of satisfaction is no satisfaction, and the opposite of dissatisfaction is no dissatisfaction. You get into a bit of semantics on this, but when we think about it, the hygiene issues are the things that we kind of tend to think of. We think about how to motivate people. Well, maybe I'll give them a salary bump, or maybe I'll give them a cool office, or we'll put a ping pong table in the break room. Well, those are really hygiene issues, and if you buy into Herzberg's theory, he would say that's not going to enhance satisfaction. It will certainly minimize dissatisfaction. The motivators that he would say are things like recognition, achievement, the satisfaction of the work itself, how rewarding that is. These are things that are much more intrinsically oriented. And so it's important to remember Herzberg's theory, because a lot of times you'll get a question on the exam that will say, which of the following, and I think we may even have one in the example questions, where we might say, which of these would have the greatest opportunity to improve satisfaction or minimize dissatisfaction. And then finally, recognizing that employee engagement is not the same as employee experience. And the subtlety here is that the experience that the employee has leads to perceptions that in turn foster engagement. Engagement's a higher level phenomenon. And so really, all of this is to say is that we're doing all of this to design employee experiences that create engaged employees who can be empowered to make decisions to ensure a high level of customer engagement. Why? Because the engaged customer, the loyal customer, is the one who comes back, increases share of wallet, tells other people. All sorts of favorable outcomes come as a result of that. There are also,
Mark,
yes.
This is Heather. I just wanted to make a quick comment on the previous page.
Yep.
For those, if you're taking the exam, Herzberg, definitely the way to go, right? But if you are ever dealing in a global situation, it is very important, if you are American, to not assume that those motivators work globally. I had a rude awakening on that in a team in Japan one time. They do not like being rewarded in public. Or thanked in public, for example. It's very embarrassing for them. So it's very important to understand your cultural context, the social context that you're in, as well as the individuals.
That is such an important point, Heather. Thank you for bringing that up, because you're right. And again, if you think about this from a holistic perspective, what this means is, as you're building out the CX orientation, there could be subtleties between our geographies or perhaps different business units, that sort of thing. So it's kind of the classic example of you have to know your audience, right? Thank you, Heather, for bringing that up. There'll also be some questions around organizational structure and governance. Obviously, one thing that I've talked about a lot so far is the importance of top-down leadership. The idea of having a identified and empowered CX team. The role of CCO, Chief Customer Officer, is coming more into play. Ongoing customer experience training. This is the idea of, you don't do this, in your onboarding and then forget about it. The process should be consistent, ongoing, and again, tying back to those concepts of the vision, brand promise, and standards of conduct. Again, in a very repetitive way, not to bore people, but to just reinforce it so that, again, it gets woven into the fabric of the organization. And then the idea of cross-functional teams focused on CX. And, most of us who have done CX programs, particularly in large organizations, it is inevitable that you will need to reach out to teams outside of your areas. So the idea of being able to have influence, build good relationships internally, break down organizational silos. And then also, this is also the other way that you start to spread the idea of CX in the organization through engaging people in the process. So those are some things. Let's do some Q&A, shall we? So this is sample question number 1. Describing why the transformation will benefit employees directly can help them change even though humans are intellectually inferior to change. Humans are hardwired to be resistant to change. Humans are socially offended by change, or humans are culturally resistant to change. Anybody care to take a stab at this one? Valerie, you can probably open up the lines. This will be the point in the concert where Bruce Springsteen turns up the house lights and everybody sings along with Born to Run.
I think you guys can all unmute your own, should you want to.
Yeah, I think it's the culturally resistant. Humans are just culturally resistant.
Okay, other comments on that? So it's actually B. Humans are hardwired. Yeah, and so I think, and this is an interesting subtlety, right? Because when we talk about humans and culture, what are we looking at culturally? Humans versus what, right? So in all the change management stuff that I've ever read is that, one thing is for sure, that people are just hardwired to be resistant to change. I know, Heather, I think you spoke extensively about that in your session.
Yeah, people definitely need to be brought along on the journey.
That's saying it so nicely.
So it's inherent in us that we just are resistant to change through millions of years of evolution.
That's right.
Where we are in the human condition.
That's how we got to where we are. Sample question number 2, which of the following is your social radar and is part of your emotional intelligence? Empathy, sympathy, apathy, or myopathy? Anyone?
You can also type your answer. Yeah, go ahead and busy with teens. Yeah, go ahead and put the answer in the chat bar as well if you want. Okay, everybody's got the program again. They got cahooted and now they had to go back to chat. Okay, almost everybody. We have one sympathy with someone dealing with teens, and then we have everybody else with empathy.
And A is correct. Empathy is really all about feeling what the other person is feeling, whereas sympathy is having almost a feeling of compassion. Again, a bit of a subtlety, but the answer is empathy. Question 3, where should companies who wish to fill the gap between a customer-centric culture and customer perception focus? Changing the thinking, habits, and behavior of customers, beginning with employees and proceeding to the executive level, changing the thinking, habits, and behaviors of internal stakeholders, or beginning with customers and proceeding to the employees. And so I'm seeing a variety, see a few C's, a few D's, a B or two. It's all about changing the thinking, habits, and
got a
behavior
little
of
bit of
internal
everything here.
stakeholders.
Yeah,
and the subtlety here is that internal stakeholders, I think it's tempting to look at B, but the reality is all those people are stakeholders. It's tempting to look at D because you start with customers and proceed to the employees. It's really the customers that give you the ammunition to make you want to change the thinking, habits, and behaviors of internal stakeholders. Question 4, if you want engaged employees, you need to provide them with all of the following except A, knowledge, B, skills, C, ambition, or D, training.
lots and lots of C's.
Everybody's nailing this one, and you're right. It's all about ambition. Ambition, of course, is one of those intrinsic factors, whereas knowledge, skills, and training are things that you can provide and need to provide. Question 5, which of the following do customer experience professionals need from their executives? A, finances, B, vision, C, commitment, D, all the above. I agree with everybody that said D. I think if this question was which of the following is the most important, then I think you could make the case for commitment, but I certainly think that commitment without vision leads to misguided or ambiguous or confusing action. Commitment without finances is just an empty promise. So the exam says C, but I say D.
I agree.
And it's not uncommon for, from time to time to have a couple of those questions where you say, I think it could go either way. And, again, 80% is the target. So, you've got a little bit of wiggle room. Sample question 6, which of the following best describes a moment of truth during a customer interaction? Building a customer-centric environment, creating transparency throughout a company, fixing a customer's low priority problem, or D, meeting the satisfaction when a customer's expectation is highest. You guys are nailing it. It's about meeting the satisfaction when the expectation is the highest. I don't even think. I did, when I first looked at this, I thought, well, could it be C because we're fixing a customer's low priority problem? That would suggest that we're really, really caring about them. And yet the distinction there is that it's not really a priority for the customer, so it really shouldn't be a priority for us. Question 7, all the following are principles put into practice in an organization to improve the customer experience, except offering talking points, listening to the customer or employees and acting on their feedback, hiring for attitude, not aptitude, and finally, give people purpose, not rules. I either picked really easy questions or this is a really smart group, and I'm going to say it's probably the latter.
It is a smart group, and they're getting smarter.
They're getting smarter, which is great. So that's right, offering talking points. Everything else is all about how you weave it into the culture. Talking points is really, you know, it's telling you how to act, not why you should act that way. Question 8, implementing tools that provide a 360-degree view of customers includes gaining an understanding of all except customer behaviors, customer information, customer preferences, or customer recruitment. We see a lot of D's coming in on this. And that's right. The idea, of course, of the 360-degree view is looking across the entirety of information that you've got about customers, including their preferences, who they are, what their behaviors are, as well as, you know, survey data or feedback data from the customer. Question 9, an employee surrounded by coworkers delivering a substandard customer experience will most likely do what? Lower her standards of delivery, not change her standards of delivery, raise her standards of delivery, or request a promotion or raise. A lot of A's, again, smart group. This is right. So what we see is this is kind of the classic regression to the mean, right? And I would argue that that may be a short-term solution. If you are a person who is highly motivated, if you're highly intrinsically customer-centric, you may lower your standards in the short term. In the long term, you'll get out of that organization. Question 10, all the following can be learned from an insurance company with a successful customer-centric e-business strategy, except A, build a closed-loop system to join data across services, marketing, and claims. B, introduce technological barriers that control customer data flow. C, serve customers through their preferred medium of communication. Or D, provide an online claims status tracking. And Pamela wants to know which insurance company. This is strictly hypothetical, and the answer is right. And so this is an interesting one. The reason I pulled this in was introduce technological barriers. I think if you read this quickly, you can almost miss the word barriers. I will tell you, when I first went through these questions and did it myself, I read this one quickly, and for whatever reason, I was thinking enablers. And so I actually, I said, no, that's, you want to do that. And then I went back and looked at it and I said, okay, yeah, you got to sound out the words, not read so quickly. Question 11, which of the following is not necessary to creating and sustaining a customer-centric culture? A, secure executive support. B, change all marketing material. C, create a shared understanding of the intended experience. Or D, build a customer experience team accountable to lead the transformation. And again, you all are nailing it. It's change all marketing material. That's not necessary to create or sustain a customer-centric culture. It could, though, be the outcome of creating and sustaining a customer-centric culture, because you certainly want to align those talking points with the nature of the culture. Last question, the best employee recognition programs use a combination of formal and informal approaches that balance feedback from A, leaders, B, peers, C, customers, D, all of the above. I think you guys might be.
I don't think there's been a single question that was all of the above that wasn't the answer in all of the classes we've done.
There was actually, Valerie, there was
one.
Well, in the battery that I had access to, I think there were maybe one or two questions, because I was thinking of my, the test taking strategies, and I thought, does it ever make sense to not say all of the above? But there were a couple, and I could probably look them up, where at least the prescribed answer was not all the above.
And didn't you have one in this presentation that was, we all said D, but you said the answer is really was C? Commitment versus all the above?
Yeah, like 3 questions ago.
That one right there. We all said D, but you said the actual answer is C.
Yeah.
Yeah, I said this is what they said, but I'm with you. I think it was D. I think, but again,
we have to go with what they said so we get the answer right.
Right. Well, so let's talk about that. And that's where I want to conclude for today. So you guys did great on these questions, by the way. But let me give you a little bit of unsolicited advice. And first things first, you can do this. You know, you have been on now 6 calls. You've paid attention. You've done the test quizzes, and that level of dedication is a pretty good indicator that you'll be able to achieve the CCXP certification. I would also tell you that if you don't get it on the first try, don't be crestfallen by that, because I know plenty of people who have had to take it more than once. The test can be a bit tricky, so there are some nuances to this. And so I wanted to provide some test-taking thoughts, and I wanted to frame this. I am a product of a liberal arts environment, which means that I can write 4 pages on anything, but you give me a multiple choice exam and I break out in hives. And I did on this as well. Some things that I found really helped me was, first and foremost, take your time. Pace yourself, but don't rush. Depending upon where you take the exam, it will tell you how much time you've got, and use that as a tool, not as a not as something to push you. So pace yourself, but don't rush. Read each question carefully. Again, I go back to my earlier example of where I glossed over the word barrier. A lot of the time, in fact, most of the time, as I recall from the exam, you'll be able to eliminate 2 of the 4 answers. So it's important to kind of walk through the rationale and limitations of the other 2 options. And there are some where you would sit there and say, I could make the case either way. Again, liberal arts guy, I would say, well, let's have an argument about it and see where we come out. But you're taking a multiple choice exam. However, having said that, resist the temptation to overly obsess after you finish the exam. So when I took the exam, it's 100 questions, and then I went through one of the things that you can do, at least in the test site that I used, you could mark questions that you weren't certain about, so that you could go back and look at those. Really recommend that you use that, because otherwise you're tempted to kind of go back and start ruminating on some of the questions. And a lot of the time, I think your first instinct is probably the right one. And then finally, and I know, Valerie, you've talked about this from time to time, prep courses can be a great help. There are a number out there that take a variety of approaches. I would tell you that I absolutely cannot recommend enough Michael Bartlett's site, the CCXP exam simulator, and his book, CCXP Exam Preparation, which I think is less than $15 on Amazon. It's got some test questions in there. The thing I like about his site, and I don't work for Michael, I don't get anything out of this, it helped me so much. He has you get 2 question sets, and it is set up to be very similar to the environment that you will take when you do the exam, including it's timed. You can mark your answer, the ones you want to go back to. So it gives you're not going into this the first time blind. He also, after the first test, it will grade your performance, and it will give you a lot of recommendations on things to read, videos to watch, that sort of thing, to help in your prep. The other thing that it does, and I think it's really cool, it will say, here's your score on our exam. We predict that you would get this on the CCXP exam, and it nailed mine within about 2 points. And so how he does it, I don't know. He also has a YouTube channel. It's got some very good free content, monthly tips, I think, exam taking tips. And so you've got that. Again, I don't work for Michael. I'm a very satisfied customer. The other thing is the proceeds from all of his work in this area goes to rescue animal causes. So this is a labor of love.
No, he's got my vote now.
Yeah, in fact, he will send out periodically. If you follow him on LinkedIn, he'll show you pictures of dogs that he was able to save because of the proceeds from his website and book sales. So and Heather, I am literally a promoter. Whenever I get the net promoter question, I usually go 8 just because I'm a little obstinate. But I would be a 10 on Michael's site. But Valerie, I know that you have a number that you wanted to recommend as well. Those are all of my comments. I'd be happy to take any questions. Valerie, I'll turn it over to you to kind of close us out.
Sure. Drop those 2 links into the chat, please. We got a request for that because it's a PDF and they can't copy them. So if you just drop those links in, that would be really good.
Yes, I'm going to stop sharing and I'll go over and grab that and then drop that in.
Okay, awesome. Well, yeah, again,
no worries. I did.
You got it? Okay, thanks a ton. So yeah, thanks again for everybody. I'm going to send out a little survey, real short one, just because we eat our own pup food, which usually is turkey and chicken. And thank you so much. We really want to hear how well you're doing. And if you have questions, the peer-to-peer network should stay up and in the discussion group. So go ahead and pull things down from that, ask questions. And then Mark, I'll see you tomorrow morning, bright and early, to do this again. So
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot. I'm hoping that this was interesting. And even more, if you all start sharing with each other and build a little community, I think that would be really awesome as well. Okay? So
thanks, everybody.
I will, as I put the final touches, the version that Valerie sent out this morning didn't have the sample questions. I'll redo this with the sample questions and answers, and I'll also include my my email contact. If you have any questions on any of this, please don't hesitate to reach out. We want to help you succeed.
Yep. And just one little interesting thing: CXPA Charlotte and Raleigh are doing a virtual video coming up this coming week, and I can probably sneak you into the video or record it. But what we're going to do is yours truly is going to do how to do an entire CX workshop all virtual. And I'm going to give people some of the tools and tips and instructions, and we're going to go in and actually edit something online and just practice that whole process. So because I don't think that we're going to be seeing each other face to face anytime soon. Okay, so drop me a note if you want to be invited. Okay? Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Valerie.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.